It's taken a really long time, but we finally moved away from a whirlwind barbarian build. Pretty much throughout my playthrough, I've been experimenting with tons of different things with barbarian, and I've always wanted to make Hammer of the Ancients work, but I could never match the clear speed that I was getting with whirlwind. Especially once I added the thorns build to the whirlwind, the amount of damage not only that I was doing, but that all of the enemies were doing to themselves was really enhancing my clear speed, and Hammer of the Ancients was just not keeping up. But I spent the past couple of days reworking my Hammer of the Ancients build to make it as good as possible, and I have to say it is absolutely fantastic now. There's definitely still a lot of min-maxing we can do because I have just switched from Whirlwind to Hammer of the Ancients, so a lot of my gear isn't min-maxed for this build. But you can see we're already critting for 2, 3, 4, 10 million damage with Hammer of the Ancients. Our Fury generation is finally enough to maintain this high damage at all times, to get the clear speeds on par with Whirlwind, but also enhancing all of the single target damage that Whirlwind absolutely lacks and makes it not so fun to play against single target enemies. So I really do hope you all enjoyed this video, and let's dive right into exactly how to build this out for yourself. Now, I always like to say, take this build as more of a guide and not as exactly what you need to do. There is always different ways to be able to cater this to your own playstyle. So make sure to take what I'm showing in this video and apply it to your own playstyle and have fun with it. Now, we're going to go over the weapon expertise and technique that we're going to be using for this build. Now, you can only apply one technique, and I still feel like there's a lot of confusion about how this works, and I'm not really sure why, so I'm going to explain it a little bit more in depth than I have before. When you apply an expertise to the technique slot, that technique will work regardless of what weapon that you're using, but you also only get the first part of the bonus. You'll notice that for this two-handed sword expertise, which is the one that we're going to be using for this build, you do get a secondary bonus if you're using a two-handed sword that you deal 30% increased bleeding damage for 5 seconds. That's not particularly good, but you'll notice when we apply it as a technique, we only get the first part of that, which is the part we actually want, which is 20% of direct damage you deal is inflicted as bleeding damage over 5 seconds. We want this because it's not only going to reduce the amount of damage we take through our Paragon points and armor and things like that, but it's also going to drastically increase our damage because of our Paragon and equipment as well. A lot of people will recommend using the two-handed axe expertise, and when you use it as a technique, it's not really that great. The increased vulnerable damage is fantastic, I suppose, but even when it's maxed out to level 10, it's really not that great compared to everything else you already have in your equipment, and you don't get the extra bonus of having that 10% increased critical strike chance against vulnerable enemies, which would make this absolutely amazing. But when using it as your technique, you actually don't get that secondary bonus. So we're going to be using the two-handed sword expertise for that bleeding damage, so that way we can increase our defense as well as our damage. Now, while we're going to be using a mace for our core skill, which is Hammer of the Ancients, we're still going to be applying this bleed, but for our basic skill, we're actually going to be using dual one-handed swords, which means we get the best benefit from the one-handed sword expertise during our basic skills, because when we're using that, we're still able to use our expertises as well as the technique combined. And I really like the one-handed sword expertise because we get a 20% chance to gain 5 fury when hitting a crowd control enemy, and since we're bleeding them at the same time, we're always crowd controlling them because we get slow from one of our abilities, which means we have a very high chance of gaining more fury, but we also get 30% increased attack speed for 3 seconds after killing a crowd control enemy because we're using 2 swords. So this is really great and drastically increases the amount of fury generation we can have. Another benefit to using 2 swords is the intrinsic stat on them, which is critical strike damage, which you definitely want. So let's get into the stats that we're using here. For a helmet, we have focused on cooldown reduction and total armor. I have max life on here as well as all stats. I probably would like to re-roll the all stats if I could. This helm is definitely not the best, but having that cooldown reduction as well as total armor is really nice. I currently have on here for lucky hit up to 35% chance to gain 1133 fortify when you deal direct damage while berserking. I'm debating actually swapping this out for the damaging an elite barrier, absorbing up to 5,742 damage over 10 seconds. I'm torn between the two. I really don't like Fortify that much. There's definitely instances where it's great because you get damage reduction as well as potentially damage increase, depending on how you build out your Paragon board. But right now, this has actually been treating me really well. For our chest armor, we've focused on damage reduction for close enemies, also making sure that we get increases to Challenging Shout and Rallying Cry and total armor. So having another 8.3% total armor is really amazing. We also have the imprint on here where we gain up to 50% increased armor when we deal any form of damage. This is going to be really important when you start trying to get above like Nightmare tier dungeon level 50 and above. For our gloves, you want to make sure you have 4 ranks of Hammer of the Ancients on here so you can increase your damage there, and also critical strike chance. After that, I would probably replace either dexterity with strength with attack speed if I could. This is actually the first time that I have replaced temerity in in a build. I've been testing this out. We've got damage reduction across the board on our pants, as well as increased damage for more critical strike chance. And then we also have on here imprinted basic skills grant 20% damage reduction for 6 seconds. 20% additional damage reduction is ridiculous. It's so good. We could opt for keeping temerity in the slot so we can have the barrier, and maybe swapping out that damage reduction onto the helmet, so that way we're always getting damage reduction as well as always getting a barrier from temerity. And I haven't tested it yet, but I think it might be the better choice. For our boots, we focus on movement speed, fury cost reduction, and strength. We could probably replace the 21 all stats, although if you need all stats for your Paragon board, it's a good stat to have on your boots, I suppose. We also have damaging an enemy with a core skill has up to a 38% chance for extending our berserking duration for 1 second. Basically, with this build, we're going to be in berserking all the time. For our two-handed mace, I focus on vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, and strength. I kept the all stats on here. I actually have a different one without the all stats, but I needed the all stats to unlock some stuff on my Paragon board. I would say damage to close or damage with core would be better than all stats if you can get it. But since I actually needed that plus 60 for some of the stuff on my Paragon board, I'm still using this technically weaker mace. For the one-handed weapon, we focus on strength, vulnerable damage, and critical strike damage. There's damage to slowed enemies on here. Would have definitely preferred to have core or close instead. And then we have attacking enemies with a basic skill increases the damage of your next core skill by 8% up to 30% more damage. So really the goal is to attack 3 times and then use our core skill. And we kind of repeat this process over and over. And this actually ties really well with what we have in our Paragon board, which we'll get into in a minute. For a second offhand, we have core skill, vulnerable, critical strike damage, and all stats. That all stats really should be strength if I could. Otherwise, this would be a perfect weapon. Also need a stronger weapon too. On here, I've been testing a couple different things. I've actually put on basic skills gain 20% increased attack speed, which I think is really imperative for this build because you want to attack fast and use your core skills as quick as possible. For a while, I was using this one here, where we have distant enemies have an 8% chance to be stunned for 2 seconds when they hit you, but you also deal 40% increased damage to stunned enemies. So maybe what you can do is instead of using the ground stomp where you get 11% increased damage, you could do is actually take this imprint here where you deal 40% increased damage. And I think you could either put it on your boots if you're already in berserking all the time anyways, or you could put it on your hands to be able to deal even more damage than what you get from the ground stomp. So there's definitely still a lot of flexibility in min-maxing in this build, depending on your playstyle. On our second two-handed weapon, I have Hammer of the Ancients Quakes Outward, dealing 96% of its damage to enemies. I actually have a better imprint than this one, but I still want to min-max this two-handed weapon. I think I can pull more strength and more core skill out of this if I want, but we do have a max roll on vulnerable and critical strike damage, which is really nice. For our gems across the board, we are using the critical strikes deal more damage to vulnerable enemies. For the amulet, I focused on total armor, cooldown reduction, and damage reduction from close enemies, as well as movement speed so it could be a fast boy. Also have skills deal up to 30% increased damage based on your primary resource when cast, which I think is really good to have on your amulet. The rings, you want to focus on vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, and critical strike chance. Instead of injured, I probably would have liked to have close or core, but also the imprints are pretty much the same across every build. You want to have whenever you cast a shout skill, it reduces your cooldown by 1.9 seconds. Having your shouts more available is always more better. And then for our ring, we're focusing on the same type of stats, but we have shout skills generate 3 fury per second while active. Our abilities are pretty straightforward. We're still using lunging strike for our mobility, enhanced lunging strike, and then combat lunging strike to be able to get us into berserking. We've got 5 points into Hammer of the Ancients plus 4 from the gloves, enhanced Hammer of the Ancients, and fierce Hammer of the Ancients for more damage. We've got 3 points into Pressure Point, and this is where I've probably changed things up a bit. I'm going to be using Ground Stomp in this build, Enhanced Ground Stomp, and Strategic Ground Stomp to reduce the cooldown of our ultimate skill. I've also got 3 points into Imposing Presence, which if you're having no problem with survivability at lower Nightmare tier dungeons, you could maybe put into something like movement speed if your heart so desires. We've got 1 point into Rallying Cry plus 4 from our armor, Enhanced Rallying Cry to get into Unstoppable, and Tactical Rallying Cry for that extra fury. We then have 1 point into Challenging Shout, Enhanced Challenging Shout, and Tactical Challenging Shout for that extra fury generation. Now I've decided to not go with War Cry and pick up Ground Stomp instead. I actually don't really like the damage increase that we get from War Cry. I mean, it's nice to have for sure, especially because you're increasing your allies' damage. And yes, if you get into Enhanced War Cry, you can get berserking from it as well, but we're already in berserking all the time, so I felt like getting this over just being able to get Ground Stomp and reset our ultimate cooldown, while also increasing our damage from stuns and everything else, was way better. I then have Booming Voice, Raid Leader, and Guttural Yell all maxed out. Then we have 3 points into No Mercy, Pit Fighter, and Slaying Strike, and then 1 point into Hamstring, which gives us the Slow, which is really important because this is the quote-unquote crowd control that we can get for our increased Fury generation. I then have 3 points into Duelist for that increased 9% attack speed with one-handed weapons, which we get with our basic skill. I have 1 point into Tempered Fury and 3 points into Invigorating Fury, which is imperative. I also have 3 points into Wallop, which are skills with bludgeoning weapons deal 15% increased damage if the enemy is vulnerable or stunned. Then Wrath of the Berserker, Enhanced Wrath of the Berserker, as well as Supreme Wrath. And then, of course, Unbridled Rage for that drastic increase in damage as well as Fury cost. The Paragon board does have a lot of min-maxing still to do. I keep messing with it, and I think I get better and better at it every time. I actually really like this one right now called Immortal Draw, which for every 5 dexterity purchase within range, skills that swap to a different weapon deal 13.1 increased percent damage, but we also get an 18% increased chance to cause the skill's damage to critically strike. So right now, with the way I have it, when I swap from using my basic skill to my core skill and back and forth, I get 101% more damage every time, as well as an 18% chance for that to critically strike when I swap to either core or basic skills. For the second node, we're using the Blood Rage tree. That way we can still get that chance for getting into berserking even more. And for the glyph, I'm using Imbiber right now, although I might switch this out at some point in time. With Imbiber, we gain increased damage while healthy, which is above 80% health. And if you can maintain that, then Imbiber is a great damage increase. I'm also using the Flawless Technique build to the right of this. And the glyph that we're using in here is Disembowel, which killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to reduce the cooldowns of your non-ultimate active cooldowns by 1 second. This is pretty much imperative for any build. I've also made sure to spec into the damage reduction from close enemies here, as well as increased critical strike damage. Then the next board I got was the one that has the Warbringer here. I haven't actually gone down and gotten Warbringer, and I don't think I ever will. Although I did put the Wrath glyph socket here, which skills that critically strike generate 3 Fury, which is incredibly important, especially with high crit rate, and increased critical strike damage. I can still spec down and increase that damage a lot with all this extra dexterity that I haven't gotten. Also made sure to get that increased physical damage and extra strength. And then the best part about this board is actually incredibly important. You've got Hungering Fury down here, which means you get extra Fury as well as 2 Fury on kill. But then there's also 2 other magic nodes here that give you another +1 Fury on kill and then another +1, giving you a total of 4 Fury every time you kill anything in the game. This is how you're going to maintain high levels of Fury at all times, and you should pick up all of these nodes for any build you're doing, regardless of what it is. And the final board that I picked up here is going to be the Decimator one. I'm not actually using two-handed slashing weapons on here, but we do want the vulnerable damage increase as well as reduction. And the glyph that we're using is the Exploit glyph. When an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds. This is perfect, especially if you have thorns, because it'll make everything around you vulnerable. And then you also deal increased vulnerable damage for all of the dexterity that you picked up within range. So that's pretty much all there is to go over for the build. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you all in the next one.